Welcome to First Talk. I'm Tamara Bull. Blade Runners is an award-winning program that success brought them to New Orleans to help the ravaged region of Ninth Ward. This program, situated in the downtown east side, helps Aboriginal youth find careers and real solutions. But first, what if you could control your weight without fad diets? Dr. Michael Lyon is an internationally renowned author and researcher that can help offer a new weight control system. No more diets, no more misinformation, just results. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be on your show.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. You know, one of the things that we were talking about, and one of the things I guess is the most interesting, is the issue of bannock. I mean, a lot of our audience is Aboriginal, or there's sort of like an idea that, you know, when we're talking about weight control, the issue of bannock inside the Native community. Maybe expand on the history of bannock and how it leads to other issues.
Well, I'll start by saying something very provocative, that bannock is not a traditional First Nations food at all.
Bannock is not a traditional First Nations food?
Not even in the slightest. In fact, and again, I hate to say this, but to me, bannock represents more than any other single thing in the world the oppression of the First Nations people by the European settlers. And the reason why I say that is if you go back in history, when the First Nations people had this part of the world as their own nations, they ate a diet totally different than the diet that most people eat today. Then what happened was when the Europeans came, they began to sort of put people into settlements and reserves. And at first they were left to starve. We were just left to fend for themselves. And there wasn't the same, you couldn't conduct the full traditional lifestyle with such a small area of land.
Well, you couldn't even leave to go hunting. So you were stuck, you know, and so you had to eat whatever was around. Right.
So you can say that first there was the starving generation, and then the government stepped in and began to provide provisions, developed kind of the welfare state and the provisions to keep people alive on the reserves. And whether you go down to, you know, the Arizona Pimas, or whether you're all the way up into the Inuit of the north, it's almost the same. The provisions were white flour, sugar, and oil. And out of that, what could you do? Well, you could make fry bread. So everywhere you go in North America, everyone thinks that bannock is their traditional diet because their grandmother made it, but their grandmother survived a time when the Native people were under tremendous oppression.
You know, a lot of people at home are going to be shocked because there's a real link between Aboriginal people and bannock. I know people who are like big-time bannock eaters are probably just in shock now. But so, you know, I was down in the United States. I ran into three women. We called them the Three Sisters because they were really cool. We're at a film festival. And they actually did a case study of bannock and how it was born out of the provisions that were made, and how people, in order to survive, you know, made bannock in all different forms. And it's so incredibly unhealthy. Tell us a little bit about maybe a traditional diet. I mean, you research obesity. So if people eliminate bannock out of their diet, what should they be eating?
Well, I'd say first of all that, you know, we're all taught the wonders of the 4 food groups.
The 4 food groups, and I never agreed with that. I think it's too simple, but you're talking about returning to the medicine wheel's 4 food group.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so instead of, you know, the 4 food groups that we're taught is, you know, meat and other protein sources, dairy products, grains, and fruits and vegetables, right? Well, you can eliminate 2 of those food groups entirely because the North American First Nations people never had dairy products.
No, you know what? I'm a typical native chick, and I can't eat dairy at all. I get so sick. I'm just like, it's a gurgle fest. My stomach is completely rebellious against it. So you're saying cut out all dairy?
Well, I'm not saying. I'm just saying. You know,
you're
traditionally
not saying that.
there was no dairy. Traditionally there was no dairy. And traditionally there was almost no grain.
No grain.
If you went to the south, into, say, you know, Arizona and so on, you'd find Native people were growing maize and a lot of starchy vegetables. But first of all, maize is not corn. It's a completely different food.
So you're talking about the corn we eat today. What about the corn we eat today?
The corn we eat today has been bred and genetically engineered over generations, and it's basically candy on a stick.
You know what? It's like, I love that candy on a stick, but it's no good.
Well, you know, again, in moderation, it's probably fine, but the problem is that we're taught that these things are perfect when maize is actually perfect. Maize is actually even made from, or contains a different form of starch. It's a starch called amylose, and amylose does not actually digest in the human body very well. It takes a long time for it to get into the bloodstream as sugar. So you look at the native diets of yesteryear, say 300 years ago, the Pima people had no diabetes, no obesity, and they had a diet 80% carbohydrates.
And today, they have the highest diabetic rate in the world. So
That's
we're
right.
talking about Native communities really like not adjusting to this new diet that a lot of people are eating.
Yeah, exactly. Today, what we eat is a diet that is loaded with starch, mostly white flour, and has almost none of the traditional vegetables. You know, if you go to a supermarket, 60 to 75% of the fresh produce was something that came from agriculture of the First Nations people of North America.
And that is so amazing, 60 to 75%. So Native people, and this is what I always say, Native people were amazing farmers. They were amazing at agriculture because they did create, because there were no tomatoes until Native people until Native people grew tomatoes.
Hunters and gatherers who knew how to gather the fresh produce from the land, the blueberries and other berries that aren't necessarily things that we would right away think are so sweet and tasty, but were very important in their diets. So, you know, really what I say is get away from the 4 food groups and look at something that honors the Native tradition in a more sensible way. And the medicine wheel forms a perfect opportunity to help people understand what the First Nations diet really should be. And so what it's made up of is essentially
Water.
You have, instead of sugary drinks and alcoholic beverages, traditionally...
And you're talking about juice as well as a sugary drink.
Yeah, juice and pop are virtually the same thing. They're sugary drinks, so they should be kept to an absolute minimum. And the Native people always consume tea.
Tea.
With, you know, there's hundreds of varieties of tea, but various types of tea with no sugar was the traditional Native beverage in almost every First Nations group of North America. And you can say that if you look at the medicine wheel, the tea represents like the west wind that comes in the fall. So think of it as a medicine wheel, the west wind, the fall season, and within that think of the beverages which are suitable for the Native person, which is more of a non-sugary drink like tea.
And then we've got about 1 minute left. So and then you're also suggesting lean meats, like a traditional meat.
So think of the north wind and the strength of the bison, or the salmon. This is the lean meats that were part of the diet and formed really most of the calories that the First Nations people ate. It was mostly salmon, or it was mostly birds and bison, lean meats that were loaded with omega-3 fatty acids, for instance, that Native people really need high amounts of. It wasn't, you know, burgers and fatty beef and all this kind of stuff, you know, ground up meats full of fat. It was lean, healthy meats.
Full of omegas.
Full of omega-3 fatty acids. And then the spring, think of the fresh vegetables, or the east wind that brings the, you know, the fresh vegetables in the medicine wheel. And the fresh vegetables were very important. The Native people gathered all kinds of vegetables. And then in the summer, you think of the emerging of the fruits and the root vegetables. So starchy vegetables like squash and, you know, pumpkin and things like that. And then vegetables like the peppers and tomatoes and carrots, all these things. You know, First Nations people should learn how to garden and get food from the earth. You know, this is one of the ways of reattaching to a very honorable tradition. Think about, you know, the focus of the Native diet should really be lean meats and fresh vegetables and small amounts of fruits that are lower in sugar, like the blueberry is a perfect food for the Native body.
And blueberries are so delicious.
Oh, they're delicious. They're fantastic.
You know, it's been so informative having you on. It's so amazing because, you know, I think some people are going to be in shock though. What? No bannock? But you know what? Great information, because it is actually it's like putting a gun to your head. It's a dangerous, dangerous food. So, no, people are in shock. Sorry about that. No more bannock for you. But after this break, the next global revolution can be women in power.